I nailed a man's tool bag to the floor of a 5-story construction site using structural lags the size of my thumb, and then I walked back to my station and finished the rest of my shift like absolutely nothing had happened. He never figured out who did it. Neither did the other 12 men working on that floor that day. And the best part? He deserved every single screw. Here's the thing about being a woman in construction: you learn fast that the same rules simply do not apply to you. A man can take liberties, shrug off confrontation, push the limits without any real social cost. But the moment a woman responds in kind, the moment she dares push back, she's difficult. She has an attitude. She gets a label, and that label will follow her from job to job to job, whispered ahead of her like a warning. So you learn to be strategic. You learn to be patient. You learn to pick your moments carefully and execute without fanfare. But patience isn't the same as powerlessness. And strategic doesn't mean you let things slide forever. Let me take you back to the morning that tested every ounce of that patience and exactly what I quietly did about it. Let me tell you a little bit about what I do for a living, because you need to understand the environment to understand this story. I spent most of my career in residential wood framing. If you've ever walked into a newly built apartment building or a freshly constructed home before the drywall goes up, before the paint goes on, before any of the finished surfaces you'd recognize, there's a skeleton underneath all of it. Studs and plates and headers and beams, the bones of the building. That's what framers build. And on a mid-rise apartment complex, you're doing that work floor by floor, with a crew of 10 to 15 people, moving upward as you complete each level, leaving your work below you and focusing on whatever is directly underfoot. It's physical work. It's fast work, and it requires a specific kind of on-the-fly spatial intelligence that people who haven't done it tend to underestimate. You're constantly solving small structural problems, reading drawings, making judgment calls about sequencing and load paths and material placement. You cannot zone out on a framing site. You are always paying attention to something. And on almost every site I have ever worked, I was the only woman. I want to be careful here, because I'm not painting every man I've ever worked with the same color. A lot of them were genuinely good coworkers. They ribbed you, same as anyone. They expected you to carry your weight, same as anyone. And when you did, they mostly left you alone and got on with the job. That's actually the working relationship you want: mutual respect rooted in demonstrated competence. You earn it by showing up, knowing your stuff, and not making anyone's day harder than it already is. But there is always someone who needs to test it, who needs to establish a hierarchy. And the subtle tests don't look like anything dramatic from the outside. They look like small conveniences taken at your expense. Small things that would get called out if they happened to one of the guys, but that you're expected to absorb quietly, because making noise about it would cost you more than it would ever cost them. I had been absorbing a lot on this particular crew, and I was getting close to the end of what I was willing to absorb. This particular project was a multi-story residential apartment complex, the kind of job that keeps a framing crew busy for months before the next trade even shows up. We were working floor by floor, framing one level and moving up, leaving the finished work below us, and keeping our focus on whatever was directly underfoot. That progression creates a specific logistical problem that anyone who's done this work will tell you about immediately: equipment migration. Tools, ladders, supplies, they all move with the crew, or they're supposed to. But in practice, gear gets left behind. It gets borrowed and never returned. It gets stashed in corners and forgotten. By the time you actually need something, it's 2 floors below you and somebody else is mid-task with it. Ladders were always the worst offenders. I had watched this play out enough times that I'd developed a system. At the start of each workday, before I got into my actual tasks, I'd walk the current floor and collect every ladder I could find, the ones leaning against walls, the ones abandoned in stairwells, the ones left in corners since the day before. I'd bring them all to one central location, organize them by size, and leave them in a clean, visible pile where anyone on the floor could see them and access them at any time. Nobody assigned this to me. Nobody asked me to do it. I did it because it made everyone's day smoother, including mine. A neat pile in plain sight meant nobody had to interrupt their work to go hunting for a ladder. Nobody had to climb down 2 floors to retrieve something that should have been up here to begin with. It was a practical solution to a practical problem, one that benefited every single person on that floor equally. So on the morning this story takes place, that's what I did. I ran my routine, collected the ladders, stacked them by size, made them available and visible. Then I pulled out my 6-foot ladder, grabbed my nail gun, and set up in my designated work area to get the day going. For the first hour or so, everything was completely normal, and then I ran low on nails. Running low on nails is not a dramatic moment in construction. It's just the nature of the job. A nail gun goes through ammunition faster than you'd think, especially on a productive stretch, and when you need more, the work simply stops until you have them. The nails were stored in the connects at ground level, the large steel shipping container where supplies are kept on most job sites. Ground level. 5 floors below me, so I made the trip. And I want to be specific here because the specifics matter for what comes later. Construction stairs on a framed-out building are not the kind of stairs you're picturing. There's no carpet. There are no finished treads. These are rough-cut lumber stringers with temporary boards nailed across them, steep grade, no real handrails you'd want to trust with any actual weight on them. You watch your footing. You move with intention. Going down is fast. Going back up is work. I got to the connects. I grabbed what I needed, 3 boxes of framing nails. Each one weighs 10 pounds. That's 30 pounds total in my arms, carried back up 5 flights of construction stairs. I made the climb. It took a few minutes. I reached my floor. I turned the corner into my work area. My ladder was gone. Let me sit with that for a second because I want you to actually register it. I had set up my 6-foot ladder in my designated work area. My nail gun was right there. My materials for the day were right there. I had stepped away for maybe 15 minutes to retrieve supplies so I could continue working. And when I came back, the ladder I had been actively using, not a spare from the pile, not an unclaimed ladder leaning against a wall, the one with my equipment set up around it, was just gone. And I already knew exactly where to find it. I set the nail boxes down and started walking. I spotted it quickly. My ladder, set up in another section of the floor, with my coworker working on top of it like it was just a ladder he'd happened to find somewhere. Like it had materialized out of nowhere. Like the nail gun and the materials that had been arranged around it hadn't told him everything he needed to know about whose setup he was walking into. I walked over to him. Calmly, and I want to emphasize that because it matters. You have to understand the calculation that is always running in the background when you're the only woman on a 12-man crew. You are not just handling a situation. You are managing the optics of how you are handling the situation. And if I had walked over with the irritation I actually felt showing on my face, that would have become the story. Not what he did, how I reacted. So, calmly, I asked him why he had taken my ladder from my active work area instead of grabbing one from the pile on the other side of the room. The pile that was right there. The pile I had put together that morning so that exactly this kind of thing wouldn't happen. He shrugged. And then he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but barely, why can't you just do the same? Go take one from the pile. Go, take one. From the pile. That's the full response. No acknowledgement that he'd reached into an active setup. No recognition that there was anything different about pulling from a communal pile versus lifting from someone's current work area. Just a shrug and a redirect. Like the question itself was the strange part. Like I was the one being unreasonable for asking. I said okay. I turned around. I walked to the communal pile and grabbed a ladder. And the entire time I was walking back to my setup, I was running the math on a very specific scenario. The scenario where the roles were reversed. The scenario where I had been the one to walk into his work area while he was away and take his ladder. You already know how that conversation would have gone. We all do. I want to be clear about something because this story is not about a ladder. Not really. Yes, it was inconvenient. Yes, it cost me time on a day when I had a task list to get through. Yes, it was inconsiderate in the most literal sense of the word. But I had dealt with inconvenient and inconsiderate plenty of times before and let them go without giving them a second thought. You pick your battles on any job. On a construction site, that calculus matters even more. What I could not let go was the double standard. And I think it's worth naming out loud because I think it's something that a lot of people, especially people who have never been the only one of something in a room full of everyone else, don't always see clearly from the outside. Think about what he actually did. He walked into my active work area while I was gone. He saw my nail gun, my materials, my setup, everything telling him this was someone's station in progress. And he took the ladder anyway. Not because he had no other option, the communal pile was visible from across the room. He took it because it was convenient, and because nothing about his social position on that crew gave him any reason to think it would cost him anything. Now run the same scenario in reverse. If I had walked over to his active setup while he was away and taken his ladder, it would not have ended with a shrug. There would have been words. Other guys on that floor would have heard about it. It would have become evidence of something: her carelessness, her disrespect for her coworkers, her inability to read the room. And I would have had to stand there and absorb that conversation and possibly apologize for it, because that is the social tax you pay when you are already operating with less cushion than everyone around you. He got a shrug's worth of accountability. I would have gotten an incident. That asymmetry is what was sitting in my chest when the break horn finally sounded. That quiet, clear, absolutely unfair reality. And that's when I decided I was going to do something about it. Break time on a construction site is its own kind of choreography. The horn sounds, the nail guns stop, and within about 60 seconds, I counted once 12 guys are clearing out, down to their trucks, down to the break area at ground level, wherever they go to sit and eat and not think about framing for 15 minutes. 60 seconds, and that floor goes from active to empty. You can feel it, the way the air changes when the tools stop and the voices move away. A specific kind of quiet that only exists on construction sites during breaks. I had been watching since our conversation. Not staring, just noting. The quiet, peripheral awareness you develop when you know you're going to need information later. I had been tracking where he set his tool pouch when he stepped down from the ladder. I knew exactly where it was. Now, for anyone who hasn't worked in this environment, a tool pouch isn't a bag you carry. It's a heavy-duty work belt worn around your waist all day, with pockets and pouches for everything you're constantly reaching for. Nails, pencil, tape, speed square, markers. When you take a break, you unclip it and set it down somewhere in your work area. It's heavy enough that nobody wants to keep it on while they're sitting in their truck. The hardware on a work belt is something worth understanding. Reinforced belt loops. Snap rings. Metal ringlets designed for hanging tools like hammers. These are not decorative. They are purpose-built load-bearing attachment points, manufactured to handle stress and weight all day long. They are designed to be used. I let everyone clear the floor. I gave it a full minute to make sure nobody was doubling back for something they forgot. Then, because I needed cover in case anyone came back unexpectedly, I ducked into the porta potty for a minute, perfectly normal at break time. Nobody thinks twice about it. When I came out, the floor was still clear. I walked over to his pouch. I knelt down. I took stock of what I had to work with. Little did he know, the moment he shrugged his shoulders at me that morning, he had already set this in motion. I want to be precise about what I did because the details matter here and because there's something I need to say clearly before I tell it. I did not damage his property. I want to state that plainly, without any qualification. I didn't cut anything. I didn't puncture anything. I didn't put a single hole in any part of his gear that wasn't already there. His pouch was not harmed. His tools were not touched. Not moved, not hidden, not interfered with in any way. Everything he owned was exactly as he'd left it, sitting in the exact same position on the exact same spot of subfloor. Except that it was no longer going to lift off that floor without a fight. The hardware on a work belt, the reinforced loops, the snap rings, the metal ringlets where you hang tools, those are existing openings in the material. Manufactured anchor points, designed to take hardware, designed to handle load. I used them. I had nails on me, 30 pounds of them in fact, since I just hauled them up 5 flights of stairs. I threaded nails through the existing attachment loops in the belt hardware and bent them flat against the subfloor with my hammer. That alone would have made a statement. But I wasn't done. For anyone who doesn't know construction fasteners, lags are structural screws. Heavy duty. The kind you use to anchor beams to foundations, to attach ledger boards to concrete walls, to connect major structural elements where failure is simply not an option. They have coarse, aggressive threads that grip into wood like a hand closing around something. Once they're seated, you do not pull them out. You have to unscrew them. And I used 3 sizes, 4-inch, 6-inch, and 8-inch, because different attachment points on the hardware gave me different clearance, and I wanted each one seated properly, deep, with authority. I drove each lag through an existing attachment point in the belt hardware, down through the subfloor lumber, and then bent the exposed end flush to the wood surface with my hammer. What that means practically, you cannot pull them out from above. The bent end locks against the wood. You'd need to get below the subfloor to unscrew from the bottom, which you cannot easily access while standing on top of it, or you'd have to disassemble the hardware on the pouch itself. Either way, you are spending time, real time, after the whistle time. Here's what his pouch looked like when I stood up and stepped back to look at it. To the naked eye, nothing unusual. It was sitting on the subfloor in exactly the same position he'd left it. Same orientation, same location, undisturbed to any casual glance. You could have walked past it 20 times during the rest of that shift and thought absolutely nothing of it. Just a work pouch someone set down at break, until you tried to pick it up. That pouch was not going anywhere. I had driven structural lags through 3 separate attachment points using 3 different lengths, each one bent flush to the wood surface. In addition, I had threaded nails through the existing metal loops and hammered those flat as well. It was anchored the way you anchor structural lumber, with the specific intention that it does not move, does not shift, does not come loose under load. Picture the moment he got back from break. He comes back to his area. He reaches down, automatic. Habitual the way you reach for something you've done 1,000 times, grabs the handle of his work belt to clip it back on. He pulls, nothing happens, not stuck a little, not just wedged. Nothing. The floor holds it like it grew there. He tries again. He pulls harder. He looks down. He's confused. He crouches and starts examining, and then he starts to see hardware. Lag screws, bent over, flush to the wood, threaded through his own belt rings. Multiple points, 3 different sizes, and nails bent flat through the metal loops. Somebody did this deliberately. Somebody with real construction knowledge. Somebody who knew exactly what they were doing and how to do it cleanly. But who? Everyone was back from break. Everyone was at their stations. Nail guns running. 12 people on the floor, and not one of them looked like they had any idea what he was staring at. I was working 20 feet away. I did not look up at the right moment. I did not look up at the wrong moment. I just worked, steady and unremarkable, the way I had been working all morning. That composure, that's the part I'm most proud of. Not the execution, but the stillness afterward. Anyone can do a thing. Maintaining a completely ordinary afternoon while the thing you did quietly unfolds within earshot of you, that is the real skill. I felt genuinely calm, patient, satisfied in a way that required no audience. He never said anything to me. Not that afternoon, not the next morning, not at any point during the rest of that job that I ever heard about. I found out later, through a mutual contact I trusted, someone I could ask without it circling back in any direction, that he hadn't suspected me. Hadn't suspected anyone in particular, as far as she knew, which honestly tracks, because I had given nobody a single reason to look my way. I hadn't reacted visibly when the ladder disappeared. I hadn't complained to anyone. I had asked a calm, quiet question, gotten a shrug, said okay, and gone back to work. In every observable way, I had absorbed it and moved on. That is exactly the kind of person who doesn't get investigated when something mysterious happens to your gear. And none of the other 12 guys said anything either. Which, when I think about it, tells you something genuinely interesting about the culture of a construction site, because some of them had to have eventually figured out what had happened, or at least formed a theory. On a crew that size, in a space that confined, information travels. People talk and people observe things, but whatever the prevailing theory was, it didn't reach the foreman. It didn't reach me. It just quietly dissipated into the background of that shift and was never spoken of again. I've thought about why that is, and I think the answer is this. On a job site, everybody has done something. Everybody has pulled a prank, taken a shortcut, bent a rule. The unspoken code is that you don't escalate to management unless something is actually damaged, actually broken, actually gone. And nothing was any of those things. His pouch was intact. His tools were exactly where he left them. He just had some unexpected quality time with a socket wrench at the end of the day and probably some very colorful internal monologue about whoever did it. In the culture of that site, that's not an incident. That's not a grievance. That's not even really a story worth telling unless you're the one who did it. And I am. I want to put something on the table because whenever I've told this story, the reactions split pretty cleanly in 2 directions, and I think both of them deserve a real response. Half the people hear it and nod immediately. They get it. They've been in environments where the rules don't apply equally, where absorbing unfairness quietly is simply part of the social contract for certain people, and they understand instinctively why this was the right move at the right time. They've done their own version of it. They know the feeling. The other half ask, why didn't you just report it to the foreman? Or, that's immature, why not let it go? Or, my personal favorite, you're just as bad as he is. To that second group, I say with genuine respect, you have never been the only one of something in a room full of people who were there before you, who set the rules before you arrived, and who do not even notice that those rules aren't neutral. Reporting it to the foreman would have accomplished exactly one thing. It would have made me the person who reported her coworker for taking a ladder. On a crew of 12, where I was already operating with less social cushion than anyone else on that floor, that is a price I simply could not afford. It would have changed the dynamic of every interaction for the rest of that job. It would have followed me to the next one. Letting it go without any response at all would have confirmed that I was someone who could be taken from without consequence. Someone who calculated quietly and then did nothing. And I'm not that person, and I was never going to be. What I did was proportional. It was targeted. It left no damage and no evidence. It communicated exactly what it needed to communicate to the only person it was ever meant for, without requiring me to be visible about it at all. It cost him nothing permanent. It cost him an hour at the end of a shift, at most. But it cost him something. And that something was the entire point. You exploit a structural inequality to take something from me without justification, and you expect the transaction to cost nothing. The universe tends to want to balance those ledgers. Sometimes it just needs a small amount of assistance. That's cold karma, and that's what it looks like on a worksite 5 stories up. Years later, that story still makes me smile. Not in a vicious way, I want to be clear about that. Not because he suffered, he didn't, not beyond a frustrating end to a shift, but because of what the whole thing represented. Because of what it felt like to absorb something genuinely unfair, to recognize it clearly for exactly what it was, and then to respond to it, quietly, precisely, invisibly, and walk away knowing the ledger had been balanced. No confrontation, no scene, no label. Just a man, 5 floors up, staring down at his own tool bag, wondering what force in the universe decided today was the day. Here's the thing about cold karma that I think about sometimes. It doesn't always arrive with a fanfare. It doesn't always look like a public reckoning or a dramatic confrontation or a moment where the other person finally understands what they did and why it mattered. Sometimes it looks like a man pulling at something that will not move, while the person who made it that way works 10 feet away with the focused calm of someone who has already finished what they needed to finish. Sometimes justice is quiet. And quiet justice, the kind where you carry the satisfaction of it alone and need no one to witness it, might genuinely be the most satisfying kind there is. Because it was never about making a point to him. It was about making one to yourself. About proving that absorbing things silently doesn't have to mean accepting them. That strategic and powerless are 2 very different things. If this story hit right for you, if you've ever been the only one in a room carrying a weight that nobody around you even noticed was unfair, I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me your version. Tell me about the time you made something right without anyone ever knowing it was you. Drop a like if you appreciated a 0 collateral damage, fully untraceable operation executed with structural fasteners and a straight face. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells the algorithm that there are still people out here who believe what goes around, eventually, finds its way back. Subscribe for more real people, real situations, real karma every day. I'll see you in the next one.